In the year 1260, there was no force on earth more feared than the Mongol Empire. From the vast plains of China to the heart of Eastern Europe, from the burning cities of Persia to the fallen walls of Baghdad, they had crushed every army that dared to stand in their way. Kingdoms didn't negotiate with the Mongols. They surrendered or they vanished. For decades, their expansion had felt less like war and more like inevitability. No rival had stopped them. No strategy had outmatched them. And over time, something even more dangerous than power took hold: certainty. The belief that they could not be defeated. To the Mongols, this wasn't arrogance, it was evidence. Every battlefield confirmed it. Every fallen empire reinforced it. Victory wasn't hoped for, it was expected. But history has a way of humbling even the most unstoppable forces. Far from the capitals they had reduced to silence, beyond the lands they had already claimed, there lay a narrow valley in what is now modern-day Israel. It was not a place of great wealth or political importance. It didn't appear on any map as a turning point of history. And yet, on a quiet morning, this unremarkable stretch of land would become the stage for something no one thought possible. Because for the first time, the Mongol Empire was about to face an enemy unlike any it had encountered before, an enemy it did not understand, could not predict, and would not be able to defeat. By the late 1250s, the Mongol Empire had reached something no empire before it had ever truly achieved, not just dominance, but the complete absence of meaningful resistance. This wasn't simply a matter of winning wars. It was something deeper, more unsettling. The Mongols had fought across continents for decades, and in that time, no army had managed to stop them. Not slow them. Not even force them into a defensive position that lasted. Victory, for them, had stopped being a goal and had become a pattern. And patterns, when repeated long enough, start to feel like laws. This is where the real danger began. Because the Mongols didn't just believe they were powerful, they believed they were inevitable. Their commanders no longer asked whether they would win, only how long it would take. Their strategies were refined to near perfection. Rapid movement, psychological warfare, calculated brutality. They didn't just defeat enemies, they dismantled the very idea of resistance. Cities that refused to surrender were erased so completely that their destruction became a warning to others. The message spread faster than their armies ever could. Submission was survival. Nothing illustrated this more clearly than what happened in Baghdad in 1258. At the time, Baghdad wasn't just another city, it was one of the intellectual and cultural centers of the world. For centuries, it had been a hub of knowledge, housing scholars, libraries, and institutions that preserved the collective wisdom of civilizations past. When the Mongols arrived, that legacy didn't protect it. If anything, it made the fall even more symbolic. The siege was swift. The aftermath was devastating. For nearly 2 weeks, the city was systematically destroyed. Libraries were emptied, their contents, books, manuscripts, centuries of thought, thrown into the Tigris River. Chroniclers later described the water running dark, not from blood alone, but from ink, as knowledge itself was washed away. The Caliph, the symbolic leader of the Islamic world, was executed in accordance with Mongol custom, a calculated act meant to demonstrate that even the highest authority could be reduced to nothing. Baghdad didn't just fall. It was silenced. And with it, any lingering doubt about the Mongol supremacy seemed to disappear. Leading this campaign was Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and one of the most formidable commanders the empire had ever produced. Hulagu wasn't reckless or impulsive. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply strategic. Where others might rely on brute force alone, he combined overwhelming power with careful planning. Every campaign followed a clear logic: gather intelligence, isolate the target, offer surrender, and if refused, apply total, uncompromising force until resistance collapsed. It worked. Every time. Under Hulagu's command, entire regions fell in sequence. Persia was subdued. The assassins of Alamut, a secretive and feared order that had terrorized rulers for generations, were eliminated. One by one, obstacles that had once seemed untouchable were removed with clinical precision. His army, estimated to be well over 100,000 strong, moved like a machine, efficient, coordinated, and relentless. And now, that machine was turning its attention toward Egypt. From the Mongol perspective, there was no reason to expect anything different. Egypt would follow the same pattern as every other conquest. A letter would be sent. A demand would be made. The enemy would either submit or be destroyed. It was a formula that had never failed. But what Hulagu did not fully understand, what no report, no scout, no prior campaign had prepared him for, was that Egypt was no longer defended by a conventional army. Waiting for him was a force shaped by a completely different kind of experience. Not nobles protecting land. Not conscripts fighting for survival. But men who had been born into nothing, trained for one purpose, and who had already proven they could overthrow the world that once owned them. And for the first time in decades, the Mongol Empire was about to encounter something its system was never designed to handle. What the Mongols were about to face in Egypt did not fit into any category they had encountered before. By every conventional measure, it should have been an easy campaign. Their enemy, after all, was made up of men who had once been bought and sold as property, slaves with no land, no lineage, no inherited power. In the Mongol worldview, that alone should have defined the outcome. Armies built on status and hierarchy could be broken. Armies without identity could not stand. But the Mamluks were something else entirely. They were not born into their roles. They were selected. Young boys, primarily of Turkic and Circassian origin, were taken from the regions around the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea and brought into Egypt through slave markets. From there, they entered a system that was less about ownership and more about transformation. They were stripped of their previous identities, separated from family, language, and culture, and placed into an environment where only one thing mattered: mastery of war. This was not casual training. It was total immersion. For years, sometimes decades, these men lived inside a closed military world. They trained on horseback until riding became instinct. They practiced archery until speed and accuracy merged into reflex. They learned to fight not as individuals, but as coordinated units, capable of moving, striking, and adapting in perfect synchronization. Their bodies were conditioned for endurance, their minds for discipline, and their identity for a single purpose. There were no distractions, no competing loyalties, no fallback identity beyond what they became inside that system. In many ways, they were engineered. What emerged from this process was not just a skilled soldier, but a different kind of warrior, one whose entire sense of self was built around performance in combat. Success wasn't measured in wealth or status. It was measured in precision, control, and survival under pressure. The battlefield wasn't something they entered, it was the only environment they had ever truly known. And then, something unprecedented happened. In 1250, these same men, trained, disciplined, and deeply aware of how power functioned, turned that system inward. But this was not a chaotic rebellion. It was not desperation. It was execution. With the same tactical clarity they had been taught in war, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt. Leadership was removed. Control was seized. And in a move that had no real parallel in recorded history, a military class of former slaves became the ruling power of one of the wealthiest and most strategically important regions in the world. The implications of that shift are hard to overstate. The men now leading Egypt were not aristocrats defending inherited privilege. They were individuals who had risen through a system that rewarded competence above all else. Their sultan, had once been a slave. His generals had once been slaves. Even the rising commander who would play a decisive role in what was coming, Baibars, had begun his life in chains. But none of them thought in those terms anymore. That identity had been erased long ago. What remained was something far more focused. So when the Mongols sent their message, declaring that no army had ever resisted them, that resistance was futile, and that slaves do not win, they were speaking to an idea that no longer existed. They were projecting their understanding of the world onto men who had already broken it. The Mamluks did not see themselves as slaves trying to survive. They saw themselves as warriors who had already conquered their own fate. And that difference, subtle on the surface, but absolute in practice, was about to change everything. As Hulagu Khan's campaign pushed westward, the next step followed a pattern that had already broken empires before a single arrow was fired. The Mongols didn't always need to fight. Often, the battle was decided long before armies met, through a message. A letter would arrive first, carried across deserts and mountains by riders who represented not just a commander, but an outcome. It was less a negotiation than a forecast. When that letter reached Egypt in 1260, it carried the full weight of Mongol certainty. Its tone was not emotional, not angry, not even overtly threatening. It didn't need to be. It simply stated what the Mongols believed to be fact. No army had ever stood against them and survived. Cities that resisted had been erased. Civilizations had disappeared. Prayers had gone unanswered. Resistance was not bravery, it was delay. The conclusion was clear and brutally efficient: surrender or join the dead. But within that message was a critical assumption, one that revealed more than the Mongols intended. The Mamluks were addressed not as equals, not even as legitimate rulers, but as what they had once been: slaves. In Hulagu's logic, this wasn't an insult. It was strategy. Men without heritage, without roots, without a past worth defending, were not expected to fight to the end. They were expected to break. It was a calculation that had worked everywhere else. But Egypt was no longer everywhere else. When the letter was read in Cairo, it did not produce fear. It produced clarity. Sultan Qutuz understood exactly what the Mongols were offering and what they were not. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no coexistence. The Mongols were not asking for submission. They were demanding it as a formality. So Qutuz responded in a language the Mongols would understand. The envoys who delivered the message were executed. Their heads were displayed at the gates of Cairo, a public and irreversible declaration. In the context of the time, this wasn't just defiance, it was escalation to total war. There would be no second letter, no revised terms, no retreat from what had just been set in motion. It was a decision that carried enormous risk. Every precedent suggested that this would provoke exactly the kind of response that had destroyed cities like Baghdad. But Qutuz wasn't operating under precedent. He was operating under a different understanding. If defeat was inevitable, then the only advantage left was how and where it happened. And that's where the strategy shifted. The Mongols were at their most dangerous in open terrain, wide plains where their mobility, coordination, and speed could be used without limitation. That was where they had dismantled armies across Asia and Europe. Meeting them there would be playing directly into their strength. So the Mamluks refused to do it. Instead of waiting in Egypt, Qutuz mobilized his forces north, toward the Levant. This wasn't just a defensive move, it was a calculated repositioning. The goal was not to avoid battle, but to control it. To force the Mongols into terrain that disrupted their advantages. Narrow valleys, constrained movement, limited visibility, a battlefield where speed and numbers could not be fully deployed. This was not how most armies responded to the Mongols. Most reacted. The Mamluks designed. At the center of that design was a commander named Baibars, a man who, like many in the Mamluk ranks, had once been sold as property and had risen through the system through sheer ability. But what set him apart was not just his skill in combat. It was his understanding of the enemy. Baibars had studied the Mongols. Not casually, but systematically. He knew their patterns, their preferred tactics, their psychological triggers. He understood that their greatest strength, their consistency, could also become a vulnerability if used against them. And so, as both sides moved closer to confrontation, the tension wasn't just building on the battlefield. It was building in the assumptions each side carried into it. The Mongols believed they were about to repeat history. The Mamluks were preparing to rewrite it. On the morning of September 3, 1260, the valley of Ain Jalut looked like an unlikely place for history to change. Narrow, uneven, and framed by low hills. Offered none of the open space the Mongols preferred. But that was exactly the point. This battlefield had not been chosen by chance. It had been designed. The Mongol commander Kitbuka advanced with confidence shaped by decades of success. His approach followed a familiar logic. Probe the enemy, apply pressure, force a reaction, and exploit the collapse. It was a system that had worked everywhere, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. There was no reason to believe this would be different. And at first, it wasn't. Ahead of him, a Mamluk force appeared and engaged briefly before beginning to fall back. The movement looked disorganized, almost hesitant, exactly what a breaking army would look like under Mongol pressure. It was the signal Kitbuka had seen countless times before. The enemy was giving way. The moment to push forward had arrived. So he did what Mongol commanders always did. He advanced. What he could not see was that every step forward was being measured. The Mamluks were not retreating, they were guiding, drawing the Mongol force deeper into the valley, into terrain where movement tightened and options narrowed. At the center of it all was Baibars, orchestrating the sequence with calculated precision. This wasn't improvisation. It was replication of Mongol tactics themselves. The feigned retreat. For years, the Mongols had used it to devastating effect. They would appear to break, lure their enemies into pursuit, and then close in from the flanks, collapsing the formation from all sides. Entire armies had been destroyed by this maneuver. It had become one of the most reliable tools in their arsenal. Now, it was being used against them. As the Mongol cavalry pressed deeper into the valley, their formation stretched. Momentum carried them forward. The expectation of victory accelerated their advance. And then, in a matter of seconds, the pattern broke. From the hills on both sides, Mamluk forces emerged at full speed, not gradually, not cautiously, but at a combat gallop. What had seemed like empty terrain came alive with movement. Archers positioned on the flanks opened fire simultaneously, their arrows cutting across the valley from multiple directions. At the same time, the retreating Mamluk center stopped, turned, and re-engaged. The Mongols were no longer advancing. They were surrounded. What followed was not just a clash of armies, but a collapse of expectation. The very tactic that had guaranteed Mongol victory in battle after battle had now become the mechanism of their entrapment. And the Mamluks executed it with a level of discipline that matched, and in some ways exceeded, what the Mongols had faced before. Their archers fired with relentless speed. From horseback, at full motion, they maintained a rate of fire that transformed them into mobile units of sustained pressure. Arrows came from the front, from the left, from the right, layered, coordinated, and continuous. There was no clear direction to counter, no single point to break through. The battlefield had become controlled chaos, and it was controlled by the Mamluks. Kitbuka fought to stabilize the situation, but the conditions that had once favored him now worked against him. The confined space limited maneuverability. The flanking fire disrupted cohesion. The illusion of a collapsing enemy had reversed into a tightening trap. At some point in the engagement, the outcome shifted from uncertain to inevitable. Kitbuka was captured alive. That detail carried weight. In Mongol military culture, a commander taken alive in battle represented more than defeat. It was a failure at the highest level of responsibility. He was brought before Sultan Kuz, still composed, still holding to the belief that what had happened was not the result of superior strategy, but of fate. Kutuz disagreed. What had unfolded at Ain Jalut was not chance. It was design. It was preparation meeting opportunity. It was an army that understood its enemy well enough to turn its greatest strength into its greatest weakness. And in that moment, for the first time in decades, the Mongol Empire had been stopped, not by numbers, not by luck, but by a force that refused to play by the rules that had made the Mongols unstoppable. What followed the battle was as decisive as the clash itself. Kitbuka, once a trusted commander of the most feared empire on earth, stood before Sultan Kuz not as a general, but as a man who had witnessed the collapse of certainty. His execution was swift, but its meaning echoed far beyond the valley of Ain Jalut. It marked more than the death of a commander, it marked the end of an idea. When news reached Hulagu Khan, the response was not rage, not immediate retaliation, but silence. For an empire that had built its identity on uninterrupted victory, this was something entirely new. There had been no precedent for failure, no framework to process it. The Mongol war machine, so precise and unstoppable for decades, had encountered a limit. and that realization carried more weight than any battlefield loss. From that moment on, the trajectory of expansion changed. The Mongols never conquered Egypt. They never pushed deeper into Africa. The momentum that had once seemed endless was finally broken, not by a larger force, but by a smarter one. Ain Jalut became the line they could not cross. And at the center of that turning point stood the Mamluks, men who had once been bought and sold, who had no inherited power, no traditional claim to authority, and yet had risen to become the defenders of an entire region. Their victory was not just military, it was symbolic. It proved that discipline, strategy, and identity could outweigh even the most overwhelming force. History tends to remember empires, but moments like this remind us what truly shapes it. No system is perfect. No power is absolute. And sometimes, the people written off as the weakest are the ones who change everything. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. There are more untold moments like this, where history doesn't just repeat itself, it surprises you.